Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Mr. Stephen Zunes. He is the Director of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Politics at the University of San Francisco. He's an analyst of US foreign policy in the Middle East, and today we unpack the high stakes triangle between the US, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Welcome, Mr. Zunes.
Good to be with you.
Let's begin with the current US President, Donald Trump. He's back to power, and are we now seeing a revival of the maximum pressure doctrine on Iran?
Well, the United States has been bitter at Iran and has targeted Iran ever since the revolution of 1979 overthrew the Shah, an important American ally, which the CIA had helped install back in 1953. The debate has been what's the best way to deal with Iran. The Democrats, in large part, have supported this idea of taking advantage of the international antipathy towards the regime, of restricting their nuclear program and on other activities through imposing sanctions and other diplomatic moves. And for the Republicans, as well as a few hawkish Democrats as well, there's been a push for military action of attacking Iran directly. And so Trump, by stressing his isolationist views, which were quite critical actually in getting him elected president twice, pointing out how the Democrats had gotten this, had supported these never-ending wars in the Middle East. Many people assumed that he would avoid supporting a direct military confrontation, but as we saw recently, even under Trump, the United States is quite willing to support war against Iran, either through Israel or directly.
Do you think these airstrikes were a little more reckless version of what we saw earlier? I mean, Trump did ask for he did order the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, but this time it was direct airstrikes on Iranian soil.
Yes, this does appear to be a rather dangerous escalation, and it raised a lot of concerns. Obviously, it's a violation of the United Nations Charter. The UN only allows the use of military force in case of a direct attack or approval by the UN Security Council. Customary international law allows for military action as a preemptive measure, but preemption is defined pretty narrowly, like a country is massing troops on the border about to invade, or seen putting missiles into their launchers aimed at them. I mean, despite Trump's claims to the contrary, Iran was years away from actually developing real nuclear weapons, and there's no reason to think why deterrence wouldn't have been adequate, as it has been relative to other nuclear powers. So it's clearly illegal under international law. But of course, Trump has shown a real disregard for international law on a whole number of levels. Whereas the Democrats, have been certainly hypocritical, certainly had double standards when it comes to international law, but at least are willing to give lip service to it. And then there's the issue of the fact that he did not go to Congress for approval. I mean, it's very clear in the U.S. Constitution that such offensive military operations cannot take place unless there's explicit approval from Congress. The War Powers Act in 1973 underscored that, and despite some complaints by some Democratic lawmakers and a few Republicans, the leadership of both parties blocked an impeachment resolution put forward by opponents of such unilateral action. So the big concern for me actually is this is indicative of a real lack of concern about both domestic and international law, and whether this might be a harbinger for further intervention under the Trump administration.
Maybe we'll talk about the domestic some other day, but let's look at the international law and foreign policy. Donald Trump often says he's transactional, but do you think he wants to make a deal with Iran? And if he does, what do you think that deal is going to look like?
Well, I think that I mean, if he really wanted a deal, he wouldn't have broken off the a Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by President Obama and other leaders, and was signed by the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, as well as Iran. It made it physically impossible for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. So if that was really the reason, then one would think that he would have just gone back to it, or gone back to some version of that. Now, I actually met with Javad Zarif, the then Iranian foreign minister who had headed the negotiations, and he told me how, these talks, there was about almost a decade of posturing, 2 years of intense negotiations. He talked about how he sat down with John Kerry face to face no less than 50 times, hammering out every single line in the agreement. And the idea that Trump says, oh, I can make a better deal because I'm this great real estate guy used to making deals, is completely naive or disingenuous. And so, I think really Trump's view and those of many hawks, within the United States, is that the goal is not really to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, again, since there were diplomatic ways of doing that, but a way of weakening Iran, of challenging the one remaining recognized state in the region that has resisted U.S. hegemony. And you think how the U.S. has been obsessed with Cuba all these decades, and Sandinista Nicaragua in the 1980s. We don't like countries that resist American policy goals. And given that Iran is something of an international outlaw due to their support for extremist groups, given their domestic repression, given the reactionary nature of the regime, in many ways it was a perfect foil because a few people are going to come to their defense. But again, I don't think the nuclear issue is ultimately what's involved here. I think it's ultimately about geopolitics.
Do you think the recent actions by the Trump administration have pushed Iran into Russia and China's corner? And how do you think it has played out? Do you think it played out in the favor, in the way they wanted it to play out?
Well, if the goal was to destroy their nuclear program, it clearly fell short on that. Probably set it back by only a few months. But in terms of the broader regional political implications, I think that while Iran had already been developing good relations with Russia and with China, they've even provided some weaponry to Putin in prosecuting the war against Ukraine. China purchases a fair amount of their oil. At the same time, they certainly don't have what you could consider ideological affinity. This is more of an informal alliance of convenience. And then Iran is, frankly, somewhat of an embarrassing ally to those two countries, just as the United States has a fair number of embarrassing allies around the world. And so I don't think this will necessarily shift things in a direction they weren't already headed.
I want to come back to what you just said, that Iran's nuclear plants and the nuclear program was set back, but not completely destroyed. But do you think Iran was on its way to build a nuclear bomb?
No, there's no indication that was their goal. There was no indication they'd made a decision in that direction. What they had been doing, of course, is since Trump tore up the agreement and reimposed sanctions, and I should mention these sanctions aren't just involving the U.S. because of the threat of punishing other countries or other companies that dealt with Iran. They essentially reinstated the more comprehensive sanctions that were there before. My strong impression is that Iran is really, I think they want the option of going in that direction if they want. That is, by enriching uranium well above the strict amounts that the Iran nuclear deal enacted, uh, they wanted to build it up to a point where they could go off in a nuclear direction if they chose to do so. No, again, no indication they had decided to do that. They did some very preliminary work on nuclear weapons research in the late 90s, early 2000s. Their failure to report that was what led to the International Atomic Energy Agency imposing these special restrictions. But that was in reaction to Iraq. They feared that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction because the U.S. kept insisting they were, even though we now know they weren't. And that, given that the international community failed to come to Iran's support when Iraq used chemical weapons to an extensive degree during the Iran-Iraq war, and they figured maybe we should have this as some kind of deterrent. But again, no indication they've done anything since then. But ironically, though, by bombing Iran like this, that they feel, hey, maybe we do need a deterrent. I mean, for example, if you're an Iranian official, you saw your name listed among your country listed along with Iraq and North Korea as part of the so-called axis of evil. And you saw how Iraq had eliminated the nuclear program, brought the IAEA inspectors back in to confirm that, and they got invaded anyway. Whereas North Korea threw out the IAEA inspectors and started actually developing nuclear weapons. They're still in power. What lesson does that give you? Maybe you need a nuclear deterrent, especially since regime change is explicit U.S. policy, and the United States has invaded not just the country to Iran's immediate west, Iraq, but Afghanistan to their east as well.
So, do you think Iran is now going to start working on a nuclear bomb? Do you think they need that for a deterrent or as a deterrent?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is possible. I mean, there's a certain strategic logic to it, though. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, it's what a lot of international relations scholars call the security dilemma. That often, when a country builds up its armed forces or its nuclear or its military capabilities in the name of self-defense, others will see the buildup as a sign of potential aggression, and it actually creates less security than it causes. And Iran, to be honest, they don't need even a civilian nuclear program. Obviously, they've got plenty of oil and natural gas. The technology they're using is decades old, so it's not like they need it to research. They could get material for nuclear medicine or the legitimate things on the international market. They really don't need a nuclear program. This really does seem unnecessarily provocative. So, despite the overly aggressive reaction, to the West, I think Iran could certainly take some actions that could diffuse the crisis to some degree. Except, again, I think that the nuclear issue is more the excuse than the reason. And we also should remember that Iran has been a major regional power on and off for 2,500 years. And this is the old Persia, and they don't like being treated like some kind of banana republic. They don't like the way the United States is saying, Israel can have nuclear weapons, Pakistan and India can have nuclear weapons, even though they're also in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. We can bring nuclear weapons in on our ships and our planes, but you can't even have a civilian nuclear program that potentially could lead to nuclear weapons. And in my time in Iran, my contact with various Iranians, it's very clear, even those that despise the regime, and that's certainly a majority of Iranians at this point, even among those who despise the regime, there's a sense of national pride here that they don't like being singled out and targeted unfairly. So ironically, this latest round of conflict has strengthened the regime. It's strengthened hardliners within the regime, and it's weakened those in the opposition that would like to see it changed.
Let's zoom out a little bit. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, they've been speaking to the US. They've also been speaking to Tehran. How's that working out? And how is Washington reading the room?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
So let's just zoom out a bit. Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, they've been speaking to the US. They've been holding talks with Tehran. Um, what role do they have going forward, and how's Washington interacting with them?
Well, those countries, Qatar in particular, have been trying to play an intermediary role. I mean, obviously, the Arab Gulf monarchies have been major rivals with the Islamic Republic for some time, and they and they very much do not want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon. They don't want to see its power and influence increased. But I think they also are pretty reticent about the U.S. and Israeli position, the idea of making war, because they know it'll just destabilize the region. It could make the regime even more hardline and potentially aggressive. If major fighting breaks out again, it could effectively close the Strait of Hormuz, where which is obviously important in terms of transporting their oil and their overall commerce. So I think they're playing a moderating role here. They want to diffuse the situation. They have a more realistic view. I mean, they recognize that for better or for worse, Iran is a major regional power. You can't pretend that they're not there. You can't just bully them into doing your way. You're going to have to be somewhat realistic. There's going to have to be some give and take. So in certain ways, I mean, the irony is these autocratic monarchies, which have a lot more than the U.S. has at stake in terms of Iran's behavior, are taking a more realistic and less ideological position than the United States is.
Now let's talk about Israel. Um, they've obviously had a major back and forth with Iran, and they managed to cripple Iran's air force. They also managed to deal heavy strikes to Iran's leadership, their army, the IRGC, and even some of their nuclear plants. Um, what's going in Israel right now? Are they preparing for more strikes from Iran? Are they preparing for asymmetrical warfare with Iran? And how is Trump in this picture? What is he doing?
Well, Israel proved once again that despite its small size, it is the predominant military force in the region. Indeed, they have bombed no less than four capitals of Middle Eastern countries during the past 8 weeks. And, they are not in, at the same time, the Iranian missiles were able to do a fair amount of damage. I mean, think of all the wars that Israel's had over the years. They haven't suffered this kind of damage ever. This is a new thing for them. I mean, Iran, suffered missile attacks that killed thousands of people for a decade during the Iran-Iraq War. Israeli cities have never experienced this sort of thing. So I think there might be some precaution, despite the one-sidedness of the war in Israel's behalf, that it would not be wise to provoke another confrontation. But there are some very ideological, very hardline hawks in Israel. They'd like to see this crisis going. In many ways, it helps them politically, because if you look at the international community, there's growing sympathy for the Palestinians. The massive civilian casualties in Gaza, the ongoing war crimes, which a growing number of international legal experts consider a genocide. But let's look back to the 2 weeks of fighting between Iran and Israel. The media stopped covering Gaza in large part. They're focusing on this war, and when it becomes Israel versus Iran, there's more sympathy for Israel. Again, given the nature of the Iranian regime and the like. So, in certain ways, it's Israel's advantage to keep the focus on Iran. And I could see them, wanting to have maybe a low-level ongoing crisis. And and then maybe an occasional low-level war where there'll be an exchange. Israel bomb, say, a couple of specific targets if they allege that they are trying to rebuild what Israel and the United States destroyed. Iran would retaliate with a limited number of missiles into Israel. There'd be a little tit for tat for a couple of days. Then there'd be a pause, and then we have another round a few months later. So we could see something dragging on, for an indefinite period. But I'd be surprised if we saw a full scale of confrontation as we did a couple months ago.
I want to talk about Palestine since you brought that up. You're right. The Israel-Iran conflict basically took away any global media attention from what's happening in Gaza. So I want to ask you as my final question: are we witnessing the death of the two-state solution And what next for Palestinians?
Well, I've been advocate for a two-state solution since the 1970s. And like many supporters of a two-state solution who recognize that Israeli security and Palestinian rights are not mutually exclusive, but indeed mutually dependent, we warned that the increased colonization of the occupied West Bank and U.S. support for Israel would make it so that just for demographic reasons alone, that a viable contiguous Palestinian state would become impossible. And it appears, as has been the case, that we need that more and more people I know, not out of any kind of hardcore anti-Zionism or anything like that, but on a pragmatic level, are saying that we at this point we really need to shift away from an anti-occupation narrative to an anti-apartheid narrative. And indeed, the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the leading Israeli human rights group B'Tselem have documented extensively that what Israel has imposed indeed meets the international legal definition of apartheid. Now, of course, given that Israel was unwilling to give up even just 22% of Palestine in terms of a two-state solution, the odds that they would give up this the system of Jewish supremacy to a single binational state or whatever seems even more unlikely. But so far, Israel's been dependent on the U.S. giving a carte blanche, providing unconditional military, financial, and diplomatic support, including scores of vetoes in the UN Security Council to block the world body from enforcing international law. But political opinion is changing in the United States. It's changing pretty dramatically, and eventually it's going to be hard politically for the U.S. to provide Israel with such a blank check, and they're going to finally find themselves isolated to the point where maybe they will have to agree to some kind of compromise. But my long-term perspective is that it doesn't help to argue ideological fact. I mean, we shouldn't go into big ideological arguments about Zionism versus anti-Zionism. What is Zionism? This kind of thing. I think we really need to focus on just fundamental principles of human rights and international law that apply to all countries. No country, not Russia, not Morocco, not Israel, has the right to expand its territories by force. No country has a right to colonize lands under foreign belligerent occupation. And this cannot go on, because it's not just horrible, obviously, for the Palestinians. It doesn't just encourage extremists and terrorists, like Hamas. Ultimately, it undermines the entire international legal order. I mean, how can the United States, in good faith, say to Ukraine, you cannot unilaterally change international borders? Well, we're the only country in the world that has recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region of Syria and de facto recognition of Israel's occupation of large swaths of the West Bank. So it pains me to say that we may be too late for a two-state solution. But again, I think the arguments need to be grounded in international law and not on ideology.
Thank you very much. That was a very informative discussion and interaction. And to all our viewers who would like to know more and read up on the work of Professor Zunes, his Substack is going to be linked in the description below. And thank you everyone for watching.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.